So, shall we begin? So, good morning, everyone. Today is the second day of the course, and as we mentioned yesterday, we are going to talk a bit about philosophy of lost in translation. And before we have a group discussion, I'm going to give a bit of lecture about this theme, philosophy of translation, which is part of the theme of the course. And after I give a brief lecture, about 20 minutes, I'm going to let you discuss in groups. So this is a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau and Cabell's text we are not going to use this time, but I just want to briefly introduce. This is Henry David Thoreau's book called Warden, and he says you only need to sit still long enough in some attractive spot in the woods that all its inhabitants may exhibit themselves to you by turns. So this is from Thoreau. So just keep this passage in your mind, please.
Naoko, could you tell us a bit about Thoreau and the book Warden, perhaps? Some people I think won't know who he is, or...
Okay, how many of you have heard the name Thoreau? How will you? Okay, most of you know about who Thoreau is, but Thoreau is a 19th century American transcendentalist who built a hut by the Warden Pond in New England, the east coast of America, and lived there for 2 years and experimented his living in the woods. And there are various themes in the book, but one of the themes which Stanley Cabell, whom I'm going to mention later, he sort of picks up the theme of this idea of translation from this book. Would you like to add a bit more about Thoreau?
No, I think that's what you said is very fine. The experimental living was to be built in the hut by the woods and seeing if he could live simply in contrast to the rich townsfolk. But another part of the experiment is also the writing about this, the writing of the so-called journal that he kept when he was in Walden. So it's an experiment in writing and in thinking as well as in living. And
he writes a lot about animals, nature, which he sees in the Walden woods. But the point of my talking about Thoreau and Cabell is this is not the only aspect of Thoreau's story. So let us try to translate Lost in Translation in the language of philosophy as translation, which I'm going to explain later. When you sit still in front of the diverse phenomena in the film, which we saw yesterday, Lost in Translation, paying close attention to the bodily movements of Bob and Charlotte, their subtle changes in facial expressions, and the words they utter, a certain thread of the film is elucidated. So later, when you discuss the film, I encourage you to remember the particular scenes which you saw in the film. So this is the preliminary observations and questions. So there are possible interpretations of the film. The first is this is just another example of Orientalism, a Western caricature of the Japanese culture and people. It is shot through the eyes of a Westerner. Japanese people are presented as exotic and as foreigners, even though the film is set in Tokyo. They are, as it were, sealed off from the screen of this foreign film. So that's one possibility of the interpretation. And another interpretation, this is a film that deals with universal human problems, including marriage and relationships. It deals in a philosophical way with the crisis of human life, with the searching of the soul. Hence, it is of relevance for all. So what are the cinematic effects? What impressions do you have of the way that Bob and Charlotte see Japan? Do Bob and Charlotte need to understand Japan as a different culture? What impression of Japan is the film director, Sofia Coppola, trying to convey? And what is your response to the way Japan is presented in the film? And another question which I would like you to pursue further in the group discussion is, what do we mean by translation? yesterday, this is from Paul's lecture yesterday. He says, translation is not of great interest philosophically if it is taken just as a metaphor for human experience. And he says, it is perhaps better seen as a metonym of the human condition. From its most obvious manifestations, translation extends through the human condition as a whole. So when you discuss lost in translation, why don't you think about this meaning of, in a concrete way, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by translation as a metonym of human condition? So the middle, the photo, this is Stanley Cavell, and this is the book which Paul and I edited, Stanley Cavell and the Education of Grown-Ups. And the book on the left-hand side is the Sense of Boredom, which is Stanley Cavell's book, which I translated with help of Paul, because Stanley Cavell's book is known to be very difficult in English, and it requires lots of efforts to translate from English to Japanese.
That's the one on the right, actually.
What's
The one on the right.
Sense of wonder?
Senses of Walden. The one you just referred to is on the right.
Okay, sorry, it's on the right. And actually, just for your information, this book is Paul's book, Beyond the Self, which I translated into 2012. So these are the books which I and Paul have been working together. So Stanley Cavell, he is an emeritus professor at Harvard University. And Cavell destabilizes our conventional idea of translation simply as a mechanical process switching from one language to another, which Paul discussed yesterday, based upon Derrida. So what is translation then, if it is not just a mechanical switch between two language systems? And here again, Thoreau comes in. Thoreau expresses this with the phrasing, truth refuses to be finally fixed. It is instantly translated. This is the phrase from Thoreau. And Thoreau's anti-representationalist view of language is characterized by transience and volatility. Translation here is the intrinsic nature of language itself, which Paul discussed yesterday morning. And what we mean by anti-representationalist view of language is this. Here is the object in the word, and here is some language. And there is a kind of one-to-one correspondence between object and language. That is a kind of representational view of language. But that is the idea which Cavell, with Thoreau, tries to destabilize. And here's again another phrase from Thoreau, which is the idea of the father tongue, which some of you may heard. And this Cavell's and Thoreau's idea of translation is represented by the idea of father tongue. This is most distinctively captured by Thoreau's and Cavell's idea of the father tongue. This is a quote from Thoreau: "A reserved and select expression, too significant to be heard by the ear, which we must be born again in order to speak." This might be a bit difficult to understand now, but when you think about translations throughout this course, please keep this phrase in mind and think about what does he mean, what he means by this phrase. And this idea of the father tongue may sound to be new to you, because usually what we use in language is mother tongue. So Thoreau and Cavell, while not negating the role of the mother tongue, say that the human being needs to gain distance on the mother tongue in order to be born again. In other words, when we are engaged with language, we need to sort of keep distance from what we are familiar with, which is our native tongue, mother tongue. This is the idea of father tongue. And this relationship between mother and father is related to this idea of translation. While Cavell says that the father and the mother are united, men and women are being united, their relationship is neither reciprocal, nor complementary, nor symmetrical. There is no pure original state in which they are united in a perfect fit. Rather, it symbolizes our dual relation to language. So our relation to language is not always unified, and it always includes this kind of idea of the gap and distance. So just to sum up this idea of philosophy as translation, which might be a bit difficult at this point, but I hope that throughout this course you will capture this idea of philosophy as translation. So first point, translation points towards more fundamental aspect of language in which the self and the other are dynamically related in a way that inheres in culture itself. And second point, philosophy characterized by a receptive, responsive, feminine mode of thought and language requires a degree of self-abandonment where one is open to the arrival of otherness and the disturbance of boundaries that it brings. It is typified by the imperfectibility of translation. So this is probably another philosophical theme which we can discuss about this idea of imperfectibility of translation and the idea of untranslatability. And the third point, philosophy of translation is inseparable from the perspective of education, where this is taken to involve the possibility of human transformation of oneself and of the other, and philosophy becomes the education of grown-ups, which is the phrase from our book, my and Paul's book. So I would like to come back to this film so that you can move on to the discussion in groups. What is the meaning of the film having been shot in Japan? If they do not learn from the Japanese culture, what is the point of setting the scene in Tokyo? It is amusing for the Western viewer, and it offers the chance of some interesting location shots. So it is interesting to see the film shot in Tokyo. Another question which we might be able to pursue is, did Bob and Charlotte encounter Japan as another culture? Cynically viewed, Bob and Charlotte might be said simply to interact with each other, carrying their own native language and their own home culture. They are coming from America, they are interacting with each other, but never really fully interacting with Japan or Japanese people. Another possible question, there is an ambiguity in the relationship between Charlotte and Bob. Is this just a tentative friendship or something more like love? I'm addressing this question because I show this film in Kyoto University teaching to international students, and there are a group of people coming from all around the world, and their reaction to the film is extremely different. Some of them consider this to be a kind of love story, and some say this is not love story. So maybe that's another interesting point to pursue. There is a puzzle over the ending scene of their separation. At the very end of the scene, the audience is not given a clear indication of where they are going in their lives. We cannot hear what they whisper to each other. The ambiguity, however, keeps open the space for an alternative interpretation of the film. This is then a typical case of experience abroad where cross-cultural encounter does not occur and mutual understanding can never succeed. This is one possibility of interpretation. Would you consider this as a film on understanding other cultures or misunderstanding? And then can we then shift our attention to the fact that neither has come to Japan with the intention to learn something? Actually, this is my own question, which I'm particularly interested in, because when you consider how Bob and Charlotte came to Japan, they did not come to Japan with the sort of positive, active attitude to learn from Japan. So I think that this is different from, for example, from the case, most of you are coming to IOE, and Japanese students come here to London with the sort of active intention, active will to learn something. But probably from that perspective, this film is quite different. What are the effects of the scenes where there are intentionally no subtitles shown in English when Japanese people talk, so that an English-speaking audience cannot follow what is going on? So there were in the film some scenes where there are no subtitle, and non-native speakers of Japanese couldn't follow what was going on. So that is another point which you can discuss. And then I want to sum up my lecture by addressing some philosophical questions. What are the implications of the title Lost in Translation? Does this imply a double sense of loss of the self and loss in communication in a foreign country? Think about various ways in which things get lost in translation. In the film, how does the untranslatable play the role? For example, the untranslatability of Charlotte's sense of distance, not only from Japan, but also from her husband, from her mother, and perhaps from her Japanese friends. This is a film about the search of the soul. You remember that the Charlotte was listening to the CD, which is called The Search of the Soul or something. She majored philosophy at Yale, which is a very nice university, and Bob says, I'm stuck, I'm completely lost. So when you have a group discussion, I encourage you to pay attention to some phrases and words which Bob and Charlotte talked in the film. Bob wants to run away, but to where? He knows that even if he goes back to his home culture, America, he will not find himself easily at home. What does his sense of loss come from then? Another philosophical question is, he also says that we sleep half of our lives. He says in the middle of the film. And his sense of void is symbolized by sample pieces of carpet which his wife Lydia sends to him and which he drops on the floor. And Charlotte asked him, Bob, are you in, what's the phrase, midlife crisis at the bar at the hotel? Think about the relationship between the theme of loss and recovery and translation. So yesterday Paul said, and I'm now talking that translation is not simply the mechanical switch between two language systems, but it involves this whole process of human translation and re-engagement with culture. If that is the case, what is this relationship between loss and recovery? And what is the relationship, this idea of translation with loss? There are more philosophical questions. Do you think Bob and Charlotte, I thought that this is very short. Do you think Bob and Charlotte, or for that matter, the director, mystified Japan? Is this process mystification? Is this a film that intends to elucidate the unknowability of another culture? So this has to do with this issue of the identity of culture. Here is the Japan with certain core of the identity. And foreigners, Americans, come to Japan, try to reach the core of the culture, and to which they couldn't get access. That's one interpretation, but is this the case? What is this idea of unknowability of another culture? More. If this is the film about understanding other cultures, how far does this experience in Japan establish the core of the identities of Bob and Charlotte? So here again, this is the question about the identity of oneself coming from certain culture. Do they, through their experience in Japan, in some way rediscover their own culture? They are both confronted with their own sense of loss in Japan, in a foreign country, away from home. How far do their encounters with Japan as different culture help them realize their sense of loss in life? I think this is it. This is the slide for tomorrow. So with this, I'm finishing my lecture, and this is just guiding. A list of guiding questions, and you really don't have to hold on to these questions. But I just wanted to encourage you to pursue this theme of translation, human transformation, and especially in connection with the idea of language, translation as internal to the condition of language, in connection with this film, Lost in Translation. And is this okay?